ที่นี้หมายถึงเทศบาลเมืองเทศบาลนครหรือเทศบาลตำบลหรืออบตครับเขาไม่ได้เรียกเป็นชุมชนแต่เขาใช้คำว่าการทำงานของชุมชนกับองค์กรปกครองส่วนท้องถิ่นเนี่ยถ้ามันประสานกันได้การพัฒนาอย่างยั่งยืนมันจะเกิดขึ้นได้นะครับแล้วเราก็เห็นตรงตามนั้นในวันนี้คือเวทีของกรมส่งเสริมวัฒนธรรมก็จะแปลกไปมากนะครับท่านรองปกติเราจะมีแต่ชุมชนล้วนแต่วันนี้เราจะมีทั้งผู้นำของเมืองคือเมเยอร์ของเมืองนะครับรองเมเยอร์รวมถึงที่ปรึกษาเข้ามานะครับการทำงานก็จะเป็นในลักษณะของถ้าพูดง่ายๆบ้านเราคือตำบลนะครับเนาะอ่าตอนที่เราทำงานกับ UCLG เราคนพบว่าคนอาจจะยังไม่รู้จัก UCLG มากแล้วก็ยังไม่มีบุคลากรที่มีความรู้ด้านนี้ผลประโยชน์ทางเศรษฐกิจอาจจะยังมีไม่มากพอนะครับในโอกาสการทำงานต่อไปของกรมส่งเสริมวัฒนธรรมและทีมที่ปรึกษานะครับต้องบอกว่าเราจะยกระดับแบรนด์ที่มีความน่าเชื่อถือหรือมีแรงจูงใจร่วมกับองค์กรระดับโลกเช่นยูเนสโกนะครับเบเนฟิตนะครับหรือว่าเขาเรียกว่าผลประโยชน์ทางเศรษฐกิจหรือเรื่องการตลาดเรื่องการท่องเที่ยวเรื่องสินค้าทางวัฒนธรรมอาชีพทางวัฒนธรรมก็จะเกิดขึ้นเยอะแยะมากมายหลากหลายหรือการสร้างองค์ความรู้นั่นเองนะครับอันนี้ยูเนสโกเดี๋ยวท่านคงจะเล่าให้ฟังต่อไปนะครับว่าเรามีด้านไหนบ้างที่ต้องพัฒนาเมืองเราจะไปในทิศทางไหนนะครับผมขออนุญาตข้ามตรงนี้นะครับสำหรับที่ปรึกษาครับตอนนี้กระทรวงการคลังก็มีที่ปรึกษา เนี่ยครับท่านเดินทางมาเหนื่อยๆเนาะจริงๆแล้วในช่วงถัดจากนี้ไปครับท่านจะได้คุยกับทางยูเนสโกนะครับแล้วก็วันเนี้ยเราต้องจบภารกิจตอนบ่ายเราจะเข้ากลุ่มของเมืองนะครับห้องนี้มันกว้างตอนนี้แต่ตอนบ่ายมันจะแคบนะครับเพราะว่าเราจะแบ่งกันเป็น3 4 5 มุมก็อยู่ห่างๆกันนะครับเพราะแต่ละเมืองก็จะพ่นพิษกันในตอนบ่ายเนาะในการจัดทำแผนที่และถอดอัตลักษณ์ของเมืองนะครับแล้วก็ ช่วงเย็นท่านผอ.อิสระท่านก็จะกรุณามาเติมข้อมูลเรื่องของยุทธศาสตร์ทางวัฒนธรรมนะครับแล้วก็ในส่วนของวันแรกเนี่ยเรารู้จักตัวเองแล้วทำแผนที่ให้ได้ส่วนวันที่สองคือการสร้างต้นแบบและฉายภาพอนาคตของเมืองนะครับที่จะดำเนินไปแล้ววันที่สองอาจจะมีการบ้านด้วยนะครับเพราะว่าเนื้อหามันแน่นมากเนาะในช่วงเย็นอาจจะมีการใช้ห้องนี้ต่อนะครับแล้วก็วันที่สามเนี่ยเราจะนำเสนอแผน นะครับซึ่งคนที่จะฟังแผนของเราเนี่ยคือวันนี้เรามีผู้แทนจากภาคเอกชนมาอยู่ด้วยก็จะเป็นคนให้โจทย์เราในตอนบ่ายนะครับแล้ววันสุดท้ายท่านก็จะกลับมาอีกทีหนึ่งนะครับธนาคารกรุงไทยเอเชียหรือมูลนิธิ SCG หรือว่าทางศูนย์การจัดประชุมนะครับหรือบริษัทอื่นๆที่เป็นภาคเอกชนคือวันนี้จะมาให้โจทย์ว่าถ้าเอกชนจะร่วมกับเมืองในการพัฒนาเมืองเอกชนมองหามิติไหนหรือไม่อย่างไรนะครับแล้วก็วันตอนที่ฉายภาพอนาคตเนี่ยเมืองต้องเอาโจทย์ทั้งหมดทั้งยุทธศาสตร์ทั้งข้อมูลจาก culture 2030ทั้งความสิ่งที่ชุมชนมีทั้งสิ่งที่ corporate อยากได้ไปออกแบบอนาคตเมืองในวันที่สองนะครับดังนั้นวันนี้ผมเชื่อว่า5 เมืองที่อยู่ในห้องนี้ครับไม่ใช่เพิ่งเริ่มทำเรื่องนี้เราทำกันมาหมดแล้วทุกอย่างนะครับแต่ทีนี้คือเราจะทำยังไงให้การอนุรักษ์นะครับหรือว่าการส่งเสริมเขาเรียกว่าคุณค่าของวัฒนธรรมเป็นมูลค่าทางเศรษฐกิจได้อย่างยั่งยืนนะครับดังนั้นขอให้ทั้ง5 เมืองเป็นเมืองที่โชคดีนะครับที่มีทั้งความพร้อมและโอกาสในการตักตวงนะครับวิทยากรให้ซุปถ้วยนี้หรือซุปหม้อนี้เท่ากันนะครับเมืองไหนใช้ช้อนซุปตักก็ได้ไปช้อนซุปนะครับเมืองไหนใช้หม้อใช้กระบุงตักก็ได้ไปเต็มหม้อเต็มกระบุงแน่นอนนะครับผมดังนั้นขอให้ทุกท่านโชคดีครับตอนนี้ยูเนสโกได้รอเราอยู่ในไลฟ์แล้วคุณลูกแก้วได้พร้อมแล้วขออนุญาตเรียนเชิญท่านครับครับ
ค่ะอาจารย์ไซมอน you might want to share your screen please ขอเสียงผ่านลำโพงเบาลงอีกนิดหนึ่งค่ะเบาลงอีกนิดหนึ่งนะคะเบาลงอีกพอดีเลยค่ะขอบคุณค่ะโอเคค่ะ
Okay.
Just one moment, Ajahn Simon, we're fixing technical issue with the microphone. สวัสดีค่ะโอเคค่ะอาจารย์Ajahn Simonค่ะ you might want to lower your volume to 0 when you speak, and at the Q&A you can turn the volume up again. Thank you. ทดสอบอีกครั้งค่ะ So my voice is not annoying you.
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure I can easily control my volume from where I am on the screen. Here we go. Okay.
ค่ะทุกคน
So I begin.
Yes, please.
Okay. So my name is Simon Ellis. I've been working, I think now, for almost 25 years for UNESCO and with UNESCO on culture. So what I'm going to try and do today is to cover some elements of what culture is. Culture is an extremely difficult subject, and it is not as easy to measure and to assess, if you like, as other subjects that we tend to measure and monitor through statistics and in other ways. I'm going to do this by looking at the current frameworks for measuring statistics for measuring culture for UNESCO, in particular the UNESCO framework for culture statistics and the Culture 2030 indicators. And I'll explain those a little later on. I'll also relate these to the global sustainable development goals, which are all the countries in the world have promised to achieve by 2030. And in fact, one of the purposes of the Culture 2030 indicators is explicitly to see how culture fits in with these goals. I'm going to present some examples from Thailand and from one or two other countries, just to show you what the kind of things that these data or the measurements might look like, and also, perhaps more importantly, to suggest what these data, what these information tells you about the development of culture, both now and into the future. I haven't kind of tried to put on the screen a definition of culture because I think culture really depends as much on individuals as anything. We know, and you will know your culture and your Thai culture, your culture as a country and your culture as a person. And for me, culture is about uniqueness. I think the important thing or the special thing about culture is this sense of difference and creativity and beauty that you see in all culture and creative activities. And this makes it, this is one of the problems about measuring it. So while often when we take, for example, manufacturing or industry, we're measuring the same thing in each country. But for culture, we're measuring something different and special about a particular country. So when we talk about the culture of Thailand, it must look and seem and read, and in the numbers, it should seem different to what's in any other country. And yet, it's also important that we want to have something where we can look at what Thai culture looks like and what the culture of, say, the Philippines, where I also work, looks like, and that we can say what's different about it. And then also, as I've suggested, what's unique about the Philippines and what's unique about Thailand. So how we do this is I'm going to concentrate on three particular ways of doing this. So first is a statistical standard. So what we mean by this is that we have a definition, a set of definitions, usually linked to a set of code numbers, and those decide or tell us what manufacturing, what food production, what arts look like. And those code numbers are used by all national statistics offices through the world. And again, I'll come into this a bit more. The second source is surveys. This is the one that everybody thinks of about statistics. You go out and you interview people, and you can interview them for their opinion. How do they perceive their identity? But you can also look at what activity they carry on, what activity they do at work, so the business surveys, and what activity they do at home, which the time use surveys. And again, I'll come back to that. However, many things about culture are not easily measurable, as I've suggested already. And culture cannot be tied down to a set of numbers. So what we've done at UNESCO, what we do in Culture 2030, and what we do when countries like Thailand report on, for example, World Heritage sites, is we ask a series of questions about whether certain policies exist. What is the national policy for the theatre? Is there financial support for putting on arts productions? What ceremonies are important? Those kinds of things. So this becomes a checklist where we're really saying, does this exist in your country? Yes or a no. Now, everybody always gets worried when about answering no to any kind of question that UNESCO might ask. But as I've said, when dealing with culture, because it's unique, every country does things in different ways. So a no is not a bad answer or a bad mark, as a teacher would say, but rather it just helps to define how culture is managed and what activities, again, are typical or unique to Thailand or to other countries we're dealing with. So, for example, I'm at the moment working in the small islands in the Pacific, the Fiji, and what works in Fiji is very different to what happens in Southeast Asia. So this is the standard which we'll follow most of the time. So this was written by my team in UNESCO in 2004 to 9. And what it does is it lists all these different definitions of different kinds of culture. And it helps by having this sense of common standards, common definitions, a theatre, libraries, what is a library and what is library activities. we allowed them to be compared across different countries and then also within the country between different places, provinces, or regions. And overall, then, these are the different, as we call them, domains in which you can find different cultural activities. And it isn't translated, so I won't dwell on it too much. But on the left-hand side of the screen, we have heritage. We then go to performance. So performance being the theatre, the arts, music. We go then to visual arts, so sculpture, painting, and so on. In the middle, we have books and press, so publishing of different kinds, and printed material of different kinds. Then moving more to the right, we have audiovisual. So that will be film, video, and then a lot of activity on the web and so forth. Then the last of the blue column, the F column, is design and creative services. So this column is what is usually called creative industries. And the core of that, I would say, is the work that is done in architecture and in advertising and then design. Design is particularly important in almost all countries today and is one of the core elements where you can look at a building or a design work and you can see immediately it comes from Thailand. But it's very difficult to define in terms of statistics and measurement. Finally, in the yellow area, we have what we are saying as related domains. So these are tourism, which I know is of particular importance to people in this meeting. And why we say related to tourism is we know that while much tourism is related to culture, it may be debated, for example, if people who go on holiday and just stay on the beach the whole time, it may not be seen by some people, at least, as a cultural practice. And the same with sports, the last column. So sports, again, in many countries can be very cultural. I always think of the most perhaps definitive would be sumo in Japan, which is so central to Japanese culture. But in some areas, sports is less cultural. And then across the bottom, we have some areas which cut across all these different areas. Again, heritage practices, particularly what UNESCO will call intangible heritage. So this is traditional performances, traditional activities, ceremonies, and so forth. And then we include education, which of course is necessary and is fundamental to all these different domains. Then we have the preservation, so activities, objects in all of these domains need to be cared for, looked after, conserved, and recorded. And then lastly, the equipment. So in that sense, what we're saying is that some activities, some of the equipment may not be cultural in itself. So, for example, when we deal with audiovisual, we may be talking a lot about ICTs. And although programming can be seen as an arts area, very close, for example, to languages. The manufacture of a computer, again, to many people, does not seem in itself a cultural activity. But that equipment is vital to nowadays the culture. And one of the big debates in all countries nowadays is about digitizing culture, as well as the implications. And for example, one item we may add here in recent times is whether AI production, artificial intelligence, is a cultural activity. And of course, we are also dealing now with cultural products, even artwork, which is created by AI. So this one now, this is the framework for Culture 2030. So what we have done here is we've taken previous slide and those 8 domains, and they have shrunk it, reduced it to 4. So from left to right, we have heritage, straight from the previous slide. We then have the economic aspects of culture. Then the third one is the education aspects of culture. And the fourth one is cultural participation. So the question here then, we're moving from a sense of the economic, but we're also looking at the social impact of culture. And again, that has very big implications about how we assess this. And then in the bottom of the slide, you will see the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, which are linked to these 4 areas. So now I will move through some of these indicators. I will begin to look more explicitly about the kinds of information in there and what it means. So for heritage, what we're looking at here, as I've said so far, is we need to look at the heritage policies. We obviously want to look at to what extent heritage is looked after, preserved. We want to look at the visitors that go there. We want to look at the kinds of activities that take place there and the policies that protect heritage and take things forward in the future. So first, the elements in this then are the checklists. We check to see whether certain policies exist. But in many ways, if we're looking at measurement, the core might be said to be visitor numbers. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see the trends in visitor numbers to some of the Thai World Heritage sites. For example, you can see very quickly where the COVID epidemic took place and the visitor numbers all decreased. So then I'll come back to these figures near the end of the presentation. But at this point, we need to say that all kinds of people go to heritage sites. So not just tourists, of course, but local people. And I know in Thailand, for example, the heritage sites are also the locations for living temples where people go to pray, and that other ceremonies and community activities take place in and around these sites. So when we look at participation and the interaction of people here, we're not just looking at visitors to come and take pictures, but we're looking at heritage sites as the core centers for community activity, for community identity, and so like this. And before moving on, I should mention in heritage, there is one global indicator, the only global indicator for the sustainable goals, the global level, is the spending on heritage, which is collected by UNESCO, both in terms of central government spending, local government spending on natural heritage and built heritage, such as World Heritage Sites. So again, we can see immediately how that works, and that spending is important to look at. Again, often even Thai people who are not living in Thailand see the World Heritage Sites in Thailand as an important part of their culture and something that they still keep in their hearts as they live in other countries. Another important part of culture on this heritage side, but increasingly affecting all forms of life, is the impact of climate change. And that occurs in many of the indicators, but is clearly most obvious in terms of where, as in many years ago, the last year that I lived in Thailand, the World Heritage Sites were subject to flooding from the river swelling from the north, from the Chao Phraya. And on the one hand, therefore, we want to see what countries are doing to avoid that damage, but also then we also want to know what practices and heritage practices will help to mitigate climate change. And again, I'll come back at the end of my presentation because traditional practices, the heritage practices, are more sustainable and can help to mitigate climate change in different ways. So that's a very quick view of the impacts from heritage. So now I'm moving on to the something of the cultural facilities. So here in all countries, there's a range of cultural facilities that are fundamental. In some ways, you could say they are the glue that keeps communities together and that helps community identity. So amongst the data that we collect, we look at libraries, museums, and galleries. They are perhaps the key ones in concern of heritage. But then we have performance venues, music, concert halls. We have cinema, which was perhaps the most popular modern art form. And then we have other facilities which support these. So we want to look at creative hubs. These are areas like the Thai Design Center and other areas where starting businesses in design or in other creative workers can come together and share ideas, or where they can have shared facilities such as marketing, accountancy plans, and so on. And lastly, traditional cultural spaces. These we have defined quite loosely, but in the context of Southeast Asia, I think we're probably talking about areas perhaps inside temples, but probably outside temples too, where people tend to gather for village performances, for larger shows, which may have a religious aspect to them. Again, I think of the Ramayana, but can also have a huge point of interest for tourists and a major artistic side to them as well. And I want to point out the right-hand side because, again, one of the things that is distinctive in cultures in Southeast Asia is the place of the river as a cultural space. As Europeans, I might go on a river cruise in Paris or along the Rhine. In Asia, the rivers are major areas for cultural performance, and I'll show a picture of Loy Prakong later on. But as we also know, floating markets. And so the river is not just a transport place. The river is an actual space for culture. And one of the other elements then we're looking for here, especially at the urban level, is to look at the area of open space that is used for culture. And again, the area around the royal palaces in Bangkok is clearly, again, one of those areas. But the picture is from Hue in Vietnam, where similar kinds of activities might be seen. And this links again to one of the SDGs, 11.7, where countries are asked to assess, to see, or ensure, perhaps is the best word, to say that all people living in towns have access to open space where they can get out into something of a more natural environment. And we know that, as suggested here, many of these open spaces are used for major cultural events. And we want to then say how much of this open space has a cultural use. So moving more centrally onto the economic, one of the areas that I always get asked about in Southeast Asia, but is really extremely difficult to look at, is the question of food and gastronomy. And I know this is very central to Thailand with the OTOPS program and to many local communities throughout the country. This picture shows you some of the problems in terms of the difficulty of comparing. You can see the codes down on the left. So if I pick the first one, 10791, in India, this is used to look at tea. In the Philippines, it is about extracting herbs for certain, again, Philippine recipes, let's say. In Thailand, the code says making snack products. And I wouldn't like to say exactly what that is, but I have tasted many of them when I've been around. In other countries, so Bangladesh, edible nuts, and in Malaysia, it's coffee. So in India, we have tea under the same code and as coffee in Malaysia. So it's difficult to compare. And because as you get to the huge number of OTOPS products in Thailand, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to bring them all together and to express and to describe them in a way that brings them together and summarizes them, while at the same time, as I said before, catching that sense of the uniqueness and the importance to a particular village. So what I'm suggesting is that while these codes are not comparable, we can say that 10791 does in fact capture some different but cultural products in a range of different Southeast Asian countries. So I think maybe, I'm hoping, as this is developed, this frame is developed, that we can begin to really capture something about gastronomy. So the other part of this is always about employment and output. So here what I've done is to take jewelry. So jewelry is one of the easiest areas to look at. So if I talk about, for example, custom jewelry made of plastic and fake stones, if you like, or just plastic jewelry, a lot of people will say, well, this is not cultural, this is just mass manufactured. However, when you take a code, some of the codes here, they talk about this one, the third one down, 12111. That code, here's the Thai, is about jewelry of precious metals. And what I would say is that if jewelry is being made with precious metals, then yes, it may be manufactured in factories, but it's probably more likely to be handmade, and it's probably more likely to have a lot more design quality in it than something that is just cheap things made out of plastic. And on the right-hand side, linking into the education, I have a picture from when I visited the Royal Jewellery Schools, and I saw the students there and the amount of care and work they put into what they were producing. So what I'm showing here then is this sense that it is very difficult sometimes to pick out a cultural product which is manufactured, which is cultural as opposed to mass manufacture, but it can be done. Jewelry is the easiest. Another one can be textiles, and another one can be furniture. And then we can go on to elements of design and architecture, advertising, as I said earlier. And the kind of things we're looking at here is in this column on the right-hand side is the contribution to GDP. So what's that saying is how much value added the manufacturing process did and what it contributes to the national economy. You can also say then on the left-hand side, the number of people in Thailand who are employed in that. And this is coming from the 2022 business survey. And so you have in jewelry a lot of quite detailed information. Okay. So again, just to finish off the economic side, this shows you the output, this sense of the value that has been added, of the success of the industries. And I picked here some of the more service sectors. So you have architecture, advertising, photography, and then cinema and film. And what I show here is the difference between 2010, when I last produced this presentation, and 2022. And you can see here how the service industries have grown. But it's interesting to see that the production for radio and TV has fallen. But I suspect this is a reflection of the internet. So it's for you to say, because I'm not in Thailand, but I suspect that what we're seeing here is that this audiovisual production has risen because people are producing films for streaming, for YouTube, for TikTok, but regular television production, and of course, especially radio, has fallen. So this shows how the trends of the differences can be very, very enlightening and can show how the times are changing. And as we move forward into a different epoch. Education. So as the core for education is that education is necessary for all culture. And in fact, I would say that education is the way that culture is passed from one generation to another. And so we see culture in every level of education. But it's difficult to measure, as usual. So for primary schools, what we have been doing is we look at the place of language. In secondary schools, lower secondary, everybody takes culture. So it's not easy to differentiate. So we ask in both primary and lower secondary, how many hours are devoted to culture in teaching. But then when we come to college, to upper secondary and to university and colleges, at that point, people choose which subjects they want to look. So then we can change the calculations and we can find an easy way of saying what percentage of students study cultural subjects. And then we ask what percentage of students in culture graduate. And when we're dealing with more economic topics or professions like architecture or advertising, these indicators give us the number of students who are starting into the job market each year. So then we're taking this indicator of cultural graduates and we're taking the previous indicators which look about job opportunities, successful industries, employment, and we can put the two together to see the picture of the cultural labor market. And that helps guide training programs again in the future. Okay. So the final dimension, so we've now covered the three dimensions. We've covered heritage, we've covered the economics of culture, and in the last slide, we looked at the education aspect. Now we look at participation. And for me, in a way, this is extremely important because this is for the economics, this is the other side. The economics, the jobs we looked at before, that's about cultural production. Here we're beginning to look at what culture is consumed, what do people take part in that is cultural. So again, we're having that other side of the cultural economy, but also we're looking at the social side. And we start here with an indicator which is, we would say, not so obvious. So what this indicator asks is what extent do people trust other people? And this seems like a strange question and a question that might not be a very reliable one. But actually, this question has been used in surveys since at least 1950. And we know that it gives you reliable answers. In other words, if you ask somebody today, do you trust other people? And then you ask them the same thing next week, when things haven't changed that much, they will give you the same answer. In other words, their answer is a reliable one that reflects truly how they feel and what is going on in society. So we asked two sets of questions here. The blue column looks at whether people in general can be trusted. And then the gray column asks whether you trust your neighbors. So what you see, which is not unexpected, is in all countries that people trust their neighbors much more than they trust people in general. And all of this begins to give you a sense of community identity, as we say, social cohesion. To what extent is the community feeling confident in itself? To what extent do they, they say they greet their neighbors every day? Do they help their neighbors? Those kind of things. And not unexpectedly, Southeast Asian societies trust their neighbors and work very well with their neighbors, as you can see from the different countries. All these countries are the pilot countries in the Culture 2030 program. But when it comes to trusting others, there is quite a lot of, trusting others as a whole, there is quite a lot of variation. So that indicator was very much talking on the social side and this sense of what is the impact of culture. This one is more the core activity that we associate with participation. So at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the visitors or visits to World Heritage Sites, and I showed you the number of visits. But the important point here is that this was number of visits and not number of visitors. One of the problem issues about cultural people participating in culture is that some people go to everything they can that's cultural. And other people go to nothing. With some people, it doesn't matter whether it's music or art or going out for ceremonies, they just do not get involved. So a lot of policies, national policies, are about trying to find those people. Because what we want is to go back to the previous indicator, is where everybody takes part in their community, that takes part in their village and what's going on with their neighbors, that they help each other and that they work together. And strong local culture has the effect of creating that kind of society. So the visitor numbers at the start of the presentation tell you number of visits, but they may probably be all the same people coming back from one month to another month. You see this mostly in theatre. Theatres often sell subscription tickets, so you can buy a series of tickets to one performance after another. And so although you have thousands of people over many months, they're the same people coming back and again. So an alternative to this is this one. So here, instead of counting how many people go to different things, we are asking, or the Thai Statistics Office is asking, how much time do people spend each week on cultural activities? And you can see some of the kind of things that they ask about here. And the numbers are the hours per week, I think, that people spend on different activities. And so you can see then differences between men and women. And then if you look at the full survey results, which I can't present here, you could see from between different towns, between Bangkok and Chiang Mai and provinces and so on. So this then begins to give you a sense of overall how important cultural activity is for people. And the big numbers issue here is if I was there, I'd be asking you to put your hand up to guess what is the most common cultural activity that everybody does. And the answer, of course, is watching television. So again, sometimes all of us wonder whether when we watch television, are we really doing cultural activity? So, but anyway,
I haven't seen any hands. Sorry. Just one moment. Would you like
nobody watches television.
Would you like me to count hands for you? So
No, it's okay. I can see them. So it's one way, and in a very important way. For me, this is as important as all the economic one. You know, what we're really asking, the core that we're trying to find out about culture in all of this really is how much do people work on cultural activities, and are they involved in producing creative objects or performances? And at the same time, on the other side, how much do they take part in culture? How often do they go to cultural performances? How often do they go to World Heritage sites? And what amount of time do they spend? So this is the whole picture. This is what you get a sense of the cultural activities, the economic side and the social side, and then where that comes from, the education, how they learn about culture, they decide about culture. Sometimes people will say that when they were at university or at high school, that was when they decided what culture they were most interested in or what job they went in. So the education forms this sense of culture for an individual or for a town or for the whole country. And we need to say that culture, the culture indicators that we're looking at here, this is indicator 21, the culture 2030 indicators, UNESCO puts them in place at the one hand for the whole country, but also for towns as well. And again, I know that one of the towns that you have there at the moment, if I can pronounce it correctly, is Lampang. And this is the Loy Prakong at Lampang that I went to some years ago. And it was so nice to feel part of a community which was not a major tourist site, but I could share food and lanterns with people who lived in the town and to really get to know the town. And that's as well what culture is all about. So I don't know if I have 5 minutes left. It's okay.
yes, 5 minutes left, please.
Okay. So again, to put all this in perspective, I have a project which I worked on in the Philippines. So this is the town of Calibo in Aklan. it is the central place where they make pineapple into clothes. Traditional Philippines wedding dresses are made of pineapple, and this is where they're made. However, as we know, the Philippines, as with all Southeast Asia, is very subject to climate problems. And Calibo in particular has a lot of flooding. And on the right-hand side, if you see the blue arrows, they mark the level at which the water floods the town. And all the dots, the red and green dots, are where people who make the pineapple, who weave the pineapple by hand looms, it is where they work. So many of them are flooded. And so this is the process that I'm then looking at. So the pineapple comes, and to go back, the pineapple comes from the area. This is a river valley. You can see the river in the town, and the river goes through the town and up into the hills. And the blue star is where a study was made of the floods. And what the study suggested was that the floods were due to the water coming down from the field terraces when the typhoon took place. However, the problem is the field terraces are now much bigger than they used to be. So if the field terraces had been used for growing the fiber that is needed for the textiles, so the particular kind of pineapple and the abaca, which is one of the other fab textiles there, if they had been planted in those fields, there would be less runoff, less water coming down to the river, and less flooding in the town. In other words, the conclusion is that if in Calibo they produce more traditional textiles using more local grown fiber, there would be less impact of climate change, less flooding, there would be better quality textiles, and the town would get more money as a result. So like this, I hope I have linked together heritage, the economy, and local community activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simon. So I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm just going to invite the participants to host 1 or 2 questions.
ท่านได้อยู่กับคุณไซมอนครับจริงๆอยากให้มีตัวแทนคำถามสัก2คำถามนะครับหรือว่าท่านวิทยากรจะสอบถามคุณไซมอนในประเด็นไหนเป็นพิเศษไหมครับในโอกาสนี้ครับ
Just one question coming.
โอเคค่ะถ้าเราจะดูตัวชี้วัดทั้ง4โดเมนนะคะก็คือสิ่งแวดล้อมพลังงานอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะถ้าบาลานซ์ทั้ง4อันเนี่ย ความสำคัญที่ยูเนสโกให้ความสำคัญอันไหนที่มีไล่เรียงหรือว่ามีอะไรอย่างนี้ไหมคะ
Among four themes of the indicators, we would like to know, like, if UNESCO would put priorities on the themes, which one would be the most important one among the four themes?
Well, I think that's a very difficult
ก็เป็นคำถามที่ยากนะครับ
um I don't when you always have to say that you're not allowed to speak for UNESCO because I'm not UNESCO and the only person who can speak for UNESCO is the Director General. But for me personally, I think the last dimension is the most important because that's the one that really touches people's lives and the local communities most closely.
One more question.
Mhm.
โลกเรามันเปลี่ยนไปแต่นี่ในส่วนของยูเนสโกเนี่ยเรายังคงใช้เกณฑ์ที่เรากำหนดไว้หรือไม่ครับ หรือว่าพอถึงปี2030เกณฑ์มันก็เปลี่ยนไปตามบริบทของพลวัตของโลกเราเนี่ยครับโดยเฉพาะเรื่องของวัฒนธรรมครับ
So I am wondering whether, like, for UNESCO, among all the indicators that we are studying today, and as you said that the world is evolving all the time, I would like to know whether by 2030, when it comes to that, whether there's going to be a change or adjustment or, like, of the indicators, whether the indicators are solid or they are changing over time.
Again, that's a very good question. They are changing. It's always tricky. So you want to keep the same indicators for a number of years, so you get a consistent set of information. But after a certain period, they have to change. Usually, that length of time is something like 3 or 5 years. However, I can say firstly that the framework for cultural statistics, which I showed at the start, is being revised now and will be published soon, a new framework. However, I believe that framework, the new framework, will not change the indicators that much. What will change the indicators, and I have two projects. I work on culture, but I also work on internet indicators. And 5 years ago, I conducted an internet indicators assessment of Thailand. And what we have completely revised those indicators now because of the influence of artificial intelligence. And I think in the cultural domain as well, the biggest area that is changing is the impact of internet, IT, and digital culture.
I have a question if I may. ขออนุญาตถามนะคะอันนี้ดิฉันมนทิราอุณากูลนะคะจากยูเนสโกกรุงเทพนะคะกับทำงานกับคุณมนทการผู้แทนจากทางกรมส่งเสริมได้พูดถึงมาตรฐานนะคะมาตรฐานของการพัฒนาสินค้าและบริการทางวัฒนธรรมเพื่อที่จะเพิ่มเอกลักษณ์ให้เมืองของเราและอาจจะเป็นตัวดึงดูดนักท่องเที่ยวหรือว่ารายได้อื่นๆนะคะแต่ในขณะเดียวกันอาจารย์ไซมอนได้พูดถึงตัวชี้วัด อาจจะฝากอาจารย์ไซมอนช่วยเล่าให้ฟังว่าตัวชี้วัดกับมาตรฐานเกี่ยวข้องกันอย่างไร แล้วเราจะแปลงตัวชี้วัดมาเป็นมาตรฐานหรือมาตรฐานมาเป็นตัวชี้วัดอย่างไรบ้าง โดยใช้ขอบกรอบของยูเนสโกในการทำงาน เพราะว่าทราบว่ากรมเอ่อมีความสนใจที่จะผลักดันมาตรฐานให้เกิดขึ้นนะคะ แล้วก็นำมาใช้ในเมืองที่จะมีเอกลักษณ์ทางวัฒนธรรมต่างๆในประเทศไทย So a word on on indicators versus standards, if you will.
Ah, thank you. So
โอเคค่ะ
I think that on the one hand, the standards are about, in statistical terms, are about getting a
คือการ
consistent definition. So even within a country, and I know, again, this can be the case in Thailand, but different provinces have different ways of looking at, we've talked about food, but different heritage, different cultural practices. But to bring that picture of the whole nation together, it needs that sense of a definition which is broad enough to encompass the kinds of activities that happen in different places, but not too broad. If it's too broad, its meaning, it loses meaning. So that's the first thing. And then the indicator is exactly that. So an indicator is always picked not to be the answer, but to be something that is sensitive to either the way things are changing or that catches a very particular characteristic. So you sometimes when you're in school or when you're writing a policy paper, you want to write a complete answer to the question. And that takes you a long time because you want to do a good job. But an indicator is to capture the answer in a few words or a few numbers. And so the indicator relates to the standard. So if you have a sense of people who are working in a particular industry, you have the definition, which gives you the sense of exactly what is included in that activity and what is not. And that comes from the standard. But the indicator might be the percentage of those people who work in a certain job. And that gives you a sense of how that industry is structured and perhaps the way the industry is changing, if that kind of job is becoming less common or more common. So it's again a difficult question to answer, but that is broadly it. The standard is in that sense of measurement. Also, the standards are, from a UNESCO point of view, have to be agreed across a large range of countries. So you're also trying to say, for example, we've been talking about textiles in the Philippines. What is similar in the Philippines and in Thailand? To what extent, if you wanted to say the strength of the textile industry in the Philippines and the strength of the textile industry in Thailand, how would you define that? What would that industry look like at a level where you get some sense of comparability? And so that usually means bringing in different fibers, different garments, different products under that definition. And you list them so people know what's in that standard definition.
We also see Mr. Joseph Lo has his hand up, perhaps to add to this discussion.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Simon. Nice to see some familiar faces. I just have two very sort of specific questions. It may be quite silly, but hopefully you can give us some guidance. Basically, I'd like to find out if gay pride in Thailand is that considered a cultural activity if you attend? My second question is that what about in terms of the area of traditional health practices like spas and Thai massages and well-being? And lastly is in terms of religious activities, would you consider attending a temple or even maybe a cremation service or ceremony part of a cultural practice? Because I think these areas are quite specific to Thailand. Thank you very much.
Okay, so for your first question, Joseph, the UNESCO as a whole and the indicators put a lot of stress on the gender dimension, and for every indicator we have something around gender differentiation. So, for example, even we have an indicator about public finance for culture, and it is possible there are strong principles of gender budgeting to put gender in public finance. In terms of gender identity and gay pride, we certainly had a lot of discussion about this in implementation in the Philippines, and I would definitely support that. I think to some extent we also have to say that it depends on the country as well, and to some degree it's a difficult area to go into, but I think that different cultures have different attitudes to it, let's put it that, and celebrate in different ways as well. To put a more positive spin on it, perhaps. But for me, it's important. Then the second part of your question was it slipped me again, Joseph. What was the second part about?
Second part refers to the traditional health practices in terms of well-being
and religious. So on that side, in fact, in Thailand, the time use survey includes, or used to, I couldn't see it in the more recent one, used to assess the time that people spent in temple or praying. So what we have generally said for UNESCO and cultural statistics is that you cannot measure people's belief. You cannot measure what's in their head. And we know, for example, that there's a whole range of religious belief, and that some people are very religious but may not show it, and some people are not very religious but still go to temple a lot. So you cannot measure the belief in the head, but you can measure the time. So you can measure how much time people spend on religious activities. And that also gets around questions of different religions, because it's still a common metric to say, whatever their religion is, how much time they spent in worship or maybe reading religious texts, or in, as you were suggesting, religious ceremonies, processions, and festivals. Festivals themselves are difficult because they're difficult to classify, but time use surveys are the best way. And time use surveys do not exist in many countries. So Thailand is lucky and has better data than many other countries in that respect.
I have a follow-up question, if I may. Now that we've heard from you the whole picture of UNESCO's framework for measuring cultural statistics or the contribution of culture to sustainable development, we have in the room today, as you know, 5 cities from around Thailand who are embarking on a new project by the Department of Cultural Promotion to try to accelerate the role of culture in these cities' development. How would you advise these cities to make use of this framework that you have identified? Should they begin to collect data now so they can have baseline data before they do their project and then data to compare after they do their project? Should they use the once they've collected this baseline data, do they look at it now and see, maybe in the area of cultural participation, it turns out that the people of my city spend very little time on cultural activities, and as part of our project, we should try to encourage them to do more. Or in terms of labor employment, it turns out that most people are working in industrial factory jobs, but we have a lot of potential to revive traditional crafts industries, and we can try to increase the percentage of employment. How can it be practical and useful to them in that way?
Thank you. I think that the first point, the two actions, I think, which are the key here. The first one is that in every city, to try and produce a database of the companies that are based there. And if it's a rural area, that may include agricultural production. I've talked about how the basis for pineapple and abaca in the Philippines. So agriculture itself can have a cultural aspect. But the first thing is that database. So that can come from administrative records. If the companies, the businesses in an area pay taxes, usually there is a record there. There may be other land ownership documents or databases may be the basis for that. But I don't know the details, and obviously it depends on different cities and so on. But wherever there is the starting of a database of businesses, I think that's the first point. Then you can build on that as possible. So from that database, you can begin to see whether your city has any particular strengths in culture. These could be food production, they could be furniture, they could be textiles, or they could be strong in services. You may have, as a result of having an arts college, or because there are tourists, there may be a big production of creative elements of different kinds. So I would say that's the first one. The second point, the second activity that I suggest on that, which is the complement, is to try to carry out a participation survey. So this survey could be of different kinds. The easiest one to do is if there is a major heritage site or a museum, to simply find out who goes there. It is important that the survey should not just be about tourists. It should be about local people too. And you need to look at perhaps how often they go there. As much as you can ask people about their age, gender issues, as much so whether you can find, is it older people, younger people, is it more men or is it more women? And maybe when do they go there? Some months because of a festival, there may be more tourists, there may be more people from the surrounding area. And that allows you then to take some decisions because you can then say, do we like this picture? Do we want more tourists? Do we want less tourists? Do we want to encourage more younger people to visit? Because perhaps visits are still more from older people who maintain the links to their traditions more than the younger people do. And how does this compare to the kinds of other things which are going on in the town? And then if it is about tourists, you can link these two data sets together. So you can say, we have a lot of tourists coming here for this heritage site. Are our businesses responding to this? Are they producing things that the tourists might like to buy? Could they produce something different? And if you know if it's men or women, the ages of the tourists or which countries they come from, again, using your businesses, you can begin to produce the cultural products which may be more attuned to the different groups that come to visit. So that's not the whole answer by any means. And there are other steps beyond that. But I think those two actions provide the starting activities. They give you both the production side and the participation side.
Thank you very much, Simon. So it's not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but it's collecting data in order to inform policy making or to trigger some actions within the business community or within the government on the ground.
Yes, to understand really where
We have
what your
1
city
minute.
does already, and then to say, and then if you know what your city does already, you can decide whether that's correct, whether you want to add to that in some way, or is there an industry that you or a business that you want to support and how to support it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simon. So I think we are actually over time. So just have to also cut the program short. So thank you, first of all, Dr. Simon Ellis, Dr. Joseph Lo, and Montira Unakul from UNESCO. So thank you very much for your time in a completely different time zones. We are actually having to cut for the second activities today. And thank you very much for such a valuable lectures and discussion.
Thank you.
ค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือ
Me for a bit โทษนะคะ Oh okay he already left It's okay I'll pass the questions to him through you คุณลูกแก้วขอบคุณค่ะ
โอเคได้ครับ